Okay, so I think you all know me by now. My name is Tom, right? I'm an educator at Cheehaw and at Flint River Aquarium. And today we are going to be talking about something that is really interesting to me because I don't know if I've shared with you guys yet, but I've done a lot of research with this animal group, which is amphibians. So we all know amphibians, right? Who knows what some common amphibians are? Does anybody have any ideas? Yeah, in the middle there.
I said a reptile. A lizard.
So a lizard is a reptile, but that's different than an amphibian. So I will tell you, you're right in that they are similar in that they are all ectotherms, which means they're cold-blooded and they are very similar, but they're a little bit different. In the back?
A frog. A frog.
Yeah, so a frog is a type of amphibian. Does anybody know the other common type of amphibian in the far back with the red t-shirt?
Oh, an amphibian, something like a frog. What's similar to a frog? Oh, I heard somebody say a toad.
Oh, okay, perfect. Yes, there's toads. Toads are also amphibians. That's not what I was thinking of. There's one more. That's also an amphibian. That's does anybody know? We'll go back to the middle here.
Me?
Yeah.
I'm called snake. No, snake is a reptile.
Snakes are reptiles. So salamanders, right?
All right, salamanders.
Do you all know what salamanders are?
Yes.
Okay, so they're very similar to frogs in that they have permeable skin, which means they have really thin skin. So we're going to talk about what an amphibian is in general. But the reason we're focusing on this group today is because they are really important because we can learn a lot about the habitat and the environment that they are found in by studying these animals. I see a hand up in the far back by the window. Do you have a question?
We're not doing any samples anymore. Put your hands down.
Okay. So we're going to talk a lot about what an amphibian is and why they're really useful for studying and how we can learn a lot about our environment. So we call them an ecosystem indicator species. So when I say indicator, that means they can indicate something, right? Or that means they can tell us a lot about the environment that they're found in. And so to start, we're going to talk about why that's possible. So like the frogs and the toads and the salamanders that you all mentioned, these are all animals that are heavily dependent on their environment. Now, a lot of animals are heavily dependent on their environment, right? All animals need resources and food and shelter, but these animals are sensitive to change. So if something changes, it's going to be a little bit more easy to notice. And so because of that, they're oftentimes a good animal to study because we may notice some responses from these animals a little bit quicker than we might with other animals. And so that's why we call them an indicator species. And so just to give you a little bit of information about their ecology and why they're capable of indicating things is because they have really thin skin. So I mentioned that, right? And actually, I'll show you a video so you can get a firsthand view of this. So let's go over here. And hopefully you can all still hear me when this is playing. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. Okay, can you all still hear me while the video is playing?
Yes, sir.
Okay, perfect. So what I have in that video that you can see in the top right-hand corner, oh, there it is a magnificent tree frog. So that is a type of frog, that's an amphibian. And what you'll all probably notice is that it looks a little shiny, right? It's got really smooth skin and it's got shiny skin, and that's because the skin of amphibians is almost always moist to a certain degree or wet. And that's a little bit more common in frogs and salamanders than toads. Toads can handle a little bit drier of environments, but frogs like that, They really like to have moist skin, and that's because they can actually breathe through their skin. And they can move water through their skin, which is kind of cool to think about, right? So they don't even necessarily need to drink water. They can just absorb water across their skin. And so because of this, though, they are really dependent on their environment to have moisture available to them. Because just as easily as they can pull moisture through their skin, they can also lose water across their skin. And so that can be dangerous for them, because what would happen if they lost too much water across their skin? Does anybody have an idea? Yeah, in the middle. They're what?
I might die.
Yeah, they might dry out too much and they might die. So that's very important. They have to be found in areas where they can maintain water. So now they don't necessarily have to be sitting in water. They can also be found in environments where there's lots of water in the air, maybe. So have you guys ever heard of humidity? Like if it's really humidity, that's when it feels sticky out, but that's because there's a lot of moisture in the air. So frogs actually like that, and amphibians like that. So they will try to find habitat with lots of humidity. But these are all just examples. You can see the frog really close now and how shiny the skin is and how wet. So these are all things that are important to frogs. And so what I just really want you to understand is that because of the sensitivity of their skin, it's very important for them to be found in habitats and in environments that will allow them to stay hydrated. They also need to be found in environments that allow them to stay warm. So they are ectotherms, which means they have to control their body temperature through their surroundings. What the temperature of their surroundings are is going to control sort of what their body temperature is. And so with all of these things in mind, they're very sensitive to change within their environment. And because of that, they're really cool to study. But with that being said, because they're very sensitive to change in their environment, they're also a very threatened animal group. They're definitely impacted negatively by a lot of change. And so, does anybody have any ideas as to what some negative impacts they may be facing are within their habitat? Who knows what might be dangerous to amphibians? Does anybody have any ideas? Let's go right here in the front with the green.
What could harm them? Amphibians. Birds? You said birds, so predators, maybe?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So one thing they need, like all other animals, is they need an appropriate amount of cover from predators. So they need to have places to hide, right? And actually, that's a really good point. So I'm going to show you an example of some research that I did. And one of the things that we were worried about is that they would have to move around without as much cover. And so they may be more likely to get eaten by birds and things like that. All right, so good. So predators is one example. I saw a hand up in the front with the pink t-shirt too. Do you want to say something?
What could harm amphibians? What we've already said predators.
Yep,
So
something else.
Calvin? Having lack of water.
Lack of water, perfect. So that's what that would fall into the category of habitat destruction, or what we might call not necessarily destruction, but habitat degradation, which means the conditions of the habitat are not as good anymore. So yeah, habitat degradation, and then even just habitat loss in general. Like if the whole wetland is lost, those amphibians could really be in trouble. So absolutely, that's a very good example. And I'm going to talk about another area of research that I did with frogs where habitat or water loss is the key thing we studied, actually. So that's really good. In the far back with the red t-shirt.
He said oil, so like, I guess pollutants.
Absolutely, that is fantastic. So pollution is another really big threat to frogs and to other amphibians, especially in their wetland. And so I'm going to talk about an example like that. You guys are doing so good. All right, let's go to the far back by the window.
Oh, he said microplastics.
Yes. Were you guys here for my microplastic? Was that the class I gave this talk?
Yeah, that was us.
I love it. I love it. So yeah, microplastics are getting into wetlands everywhere, right? Actually, I'll be honest, I don't know if anybody has done research yet to determine if microplastics are finding their way into frogs yet. But I would not be surprised because we talked about they can get into organisms that are even smaller than frogs, right? That they can start as low as like plankton and things like that. So I would not be surprised, and that could definitely be causing some issues. And that would be another form of pollutants, right? Cool, very good. All right, and then there's one other big one I want to talk about, and we'll get to that in just a little bit. So one other thing before we start getting into specific examples that I want to mention is that how many different types of habitat do you think a frog has? And what are some examples of a habitat that a frog uses within a single year? So how many different types of habitat do you think a frog uses in 1 year? Does anybody have any ideas? Up front with the pink t-shirt, maybe?
I called on somebody that.
Oh, okay, yep.
Go ahead. How many habitats do you think that they have in 1 year? How many different places do you think they might live in 1 year? He says 2.
Okay, so there's 2 big ones, absolutely. And the first is the wetland, right? A lot of frogs go to wetlands like ponds to lay their eggs. And so those frogs start their life as an egg and as a little tadpole, and then they metamorph, and then they use terrestrial habitat too, like forests, right? So that's something else that's really important to keep in mind when we talk about other things, because not only could they be impacted in the pond or the wetland through pollutants, like you guys mentioned, but also through things like habitat loss and fragmentation. So when we talk about fragmentation, we are talking about things that could separate different habitat types or maybe put a barrier between them so frogs can't get from one to the other. And so a big threat that we haven't covered yet for frogs and amphibians is things like fragmentation. Does anybody have an idea as to what we as humans have made might be a barrier or something that separates different habitat types out in the environment? Does anybody have any ideas? Miss Murphy, do you want to call on somebody? I can't see everybody.
Yeah. Dakota, is your hand up? All right. Say the question one more time, Mr. Tom.
So what is a type of fragmentation or a type of physical barrier that we as people might have made that could actually prevent things like a frog from moving to one area or another?
Okay. Calvin? A wall. Okay. He says a wall, but I think he probably means like a dam.
Yep. Okay. Perfect. So yeah, there's definitely some amphibians, especially salamanders, that are found in streams. So things like a dam might prevent an animal from moving up or downstream. What else?
Just a barrier or invisible wall. Oh, that's kind of what Calvin was saying. Boats. Boats.
So boats probably aren't going to be a big threat to amphibians because amphibians are found in more of things like wetlands, like ponds or things like that. But definitely boats are a big concern for things like sea turtles or other fish that are found out in bigger ocean environments and things like that. So you're not wrong, but not necessarily for smaller amphibians, right? All right, one more person and then we're gonna.
That's not man-made though. Is that? Big old wave. That's not man-made either. Awesome. Tornado. A big separating. Okay, he said people keeping them as pets.
Okay, so that's a big threat, actually. Yes, that is a big threat. Is people removing animals from their environment and keeping them as pets? Yep. But when I was thinking of fragmentation or something that we might actually build in the environment that could block movement or prevent movement or make it more difficult, think about things like roads. We build roads all throughout. There are roads everywhere now, right? And a lot of animals have to try to cross roads to get from one habitat to another. But if roads are big enough, if you think if we put in like a 4-lane highway each way and there's 8 lanes, there's a lot of animals that can't cross that anymore. And that creates a physical barrier. Or even if it's just a little 2-lane street in a neighborhood, frogs might try to cross that, but what's driving on the roads that might hurt the frogs? Cars, right? So that's a type of barrier. All right, so I'm going to share my screen again, and we're going to talk about some specific examples of how frogs and amphibians and salamanders can be good indicators of change within their environment. So I'm going to share my screen again. So here is another type of amphibian. This is now a salamander. So we looked at the frog, right? This is what we call a marbled salamander. We actually have this animal at the aquarium. So it's a really cool animal. You can tell just like the frog, it has that kind of moist, soft looking skin. And so this is also a type of amphibian that's going to lay eggs in a wetland. And then once it's done laying its eggs, it's going to do exactly what it's doing right now. It's going to try to go into terrestrial habitat and burrow down into the ground. So although this is a marbled salamander, they're kind of referred to overall as mole salamanders. So a mole is a mammal, right, that tries to dig into the ground. But since a lot of these salamanders like to go into burrows, we refer to them as mole salamanders. So I just want to give another example of an amphibian. All right, so we talked about amphibians have multiple habitat types, right? They like to breed in wetlands. And so this is this doesn't even really look like a pond or a wetland, right? It just looks like a puddle in the grass. But that egg mass that I have a picture of on the right, that's what frogs lay their eggs in, is an egg mass like that. And then tadpoles, you can see a couple tadpoles on that egg, will start to hatch from those egg masses. And that was actually found in that wetland that I have a picture of. And that's just right behind Cheehaw Park and Zoo, right in the backyard. So pretty incredible that amphibians can lay their eggs in something as small as that. But what they like is small wetlands like that, because someone mentioned earlier that they like they don't want to get eaten by birds. So something that's a threat to them is predators. And what's not in these really shallow wetlands or ponds like this are fish. And fish are going to eat the tadpoles. So amphibians actually prefer to lay their eggs in wetlands like this that are really small and probably dry up at some point, because their tadpoles are able to develop fast enough that they can turn into a frog before the wetland dries up. But there's still not going to be fish, because fish wouldn't survive there if it does dry up at certain portions of the year, right? Fish need to be in permanent water that sticks around all year long. All right, so here's an example of a frog that is super bloated, right? That's not what the frog should look like. The frog should look a lot more narrow. So this really bloated frog is sick. And so what I have a picture of here is a road and a wetland near the road. And so not only do roads, you can see right here that it's going to be right next to that wetland. Not only is it going to be dangerous because cars are driving on it and frogs might try to hop on this road, but also a lot of runoff can come off of this road and go into that wetland. So when I say runoff, I mean there can be chemicals that are on that road, such as like oil leaking on the road, or a big one, and something that we see up north a lot. So you guys probably won't see this a lot here because we're in Georgia and it's warm. But who knows what we put on roads up north where I'm from when there's lots of snow. Do you guys know what they put down on the roads?
Oil.
Nope, not oil. Does anybody know?
I heard someone say salt.
Salt. Yes, we put road salt down, and that helps the snow melt so that there's not a lot of snow and ice on the road so we can still drive on them. But what happens is salt will run off these roads and go into these wetlands, and it'll increase the salinity, and then it causes frogs like this and other frogs to get super bloated. And then I don't know if you can picture it, but Do you think a frog is going to be able to hop easier if it's this bloated or if it's normal?
No. Normal.
Normal. So this frog's going to really struggle to hop, and it's not going to be able to move around as fast. So then it may be more likely to get eaten by a predator. So now we have this feed having it connect to another threat. But they also, if they can't hop around as well, what else might they not be able to do? Swim. Or they might not be able to catch food super well, right? These frogs need to hop around to catch food. So if they can't hop around as well as they normally do, then they may not be able to catch food and get a lot of energy, and frogs need energy to grow and to reproduce and survive, right? So this is a perfect example of a type of pollutant that may be caused by humans that's directly put down and then running off into wetlands and causing frogs to get sick. And so if we notice frogs getting sick like this is going to be a really good indication that something is wrong in that environment, right? So that's what I was talking about when I say they are a good indicator species. So let's take another look at another example just like this. So what's wrong with this frog?
It's too old. Pricey. It has too many legs.
It has too many legs. So this is what we call a deformity, and this can be caused by other types of pollution. So a little bit different than putting salt on roads, but oftentimes what we put in farmlands or on lawns is things like pesticides or herbicides, right? So we want to get rid of pests that may be eating crops on farmland. We may be spraying our lawns to prevent there from being more mosquitoes, right? There's lots of different chemicals we can put on plants or on lawns. And then the same thing is going to happen. Those chemicals can run through the ground, on the ground when it rains, all the way until it reaches a wetland. And it can cause deformities like this in animals. And so kind of like that other frog, this frog is not going to be able to move as good, and it's not going to function as well as a frog that's normal and that has the right number of legs or anything like that. And so a big problem is obviously the deformity itself and that frog being sick. But what's going to happen if if this starts happening to too many frogs and a lot of frogs start getting these deformities or start getting bloated? What do you think is going to happen?
They're going to be extinct.
Yeah, they may lose that population. So now they probably won't go extinct because this is probably happening more at a site-by-site basis, right? But they might lose a population, which means like the frogs found at that wetland or at that area might get lost. So absolutely, yep. And I see, Miss Murphy, do I see a question in the front?
They might die.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely possible. Frogs can recover from things like this. So like this frog looks healthy other than the extra leg, right? But inevitably it might cause things like, it might cause it to get eaten faster. So it may have that disadvantage. And some of those bloated frogs, I've seen frogs bloated in the past that have recovered from that. And if they get out of that environment that's causing the bloating, they can return back to normal sometimes. So it's more of a thing that could gradually build to get to a point where they have more disadvantages than healthy animals. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right, so what can we do to help? We've talked a lot about these amphibians and certain things like pollutants and roads, the things that are threatening these animals, but what can be done to help? One thing is research. So one other big impact that we haven't really talked about yet, or we've kind of talked about, is someone mentioned water loss, right? Like if the water dries up. So one big thing that's causing this is warming. And so if environments are warming up too much, a lot of water might be lost from the environment. So I actually did some research up in the subarctic where polar bears are found. I'm not sure if I've shared that with you guys yet or not. But I did some research up in the subarctic where polar bears are found. But there's also a frog found up there. There's actually two types of frogs found up there. And that's because they can freeze solid during the winter. And so what you're looking at is this landscape where I did my research, and what you're gonna notice is all of these wetlands, right? And these wetlands are really, really shallow. They're only, you can walk across them and probably only be up to your waist or like your stomach, because they're super shallow. And that's because there's ice underneath those wetlands that are allowing them to stay filled. But what's going to happen is if it warms too much and that ice underneath those wetlands starts to melt, then that water is going to be lost because there's going to be nothing trapping the water at the surface anymore. And so that could be a great example of how warming could cause water to be lost. And then in general, if it's warming, water might start to evaporate faster, right? So it might just start to evaporate right off the surface faster. And environments in general could start getting drier if that water is lost. And we've talked about that frogs need moisture, right? So this is all really important to keep in mind. All right, so that's a really cool example too. So one thing that we can do to help is research animals. So this is a classic example of, I shouldn't say a classic example, that's, but this is a good example of research that was done to learn about how changing conditions in the environment can help us learn about how a species like a wood frog that's found up here is going to be impacted in the future by some change. And then this is a very different example because this is not a very natural and undisturbed landscape like that subarctic up there. You can tell, look at all the roads here, right? So this is looking at more of like a city. And so you can see all of the roads and all of the houses built around those roads and even some bigger buildings like businesses. And so does everybody see those two yellow stars on the map? Yes. So that is where we did some research to understand how things like a road, you can tell one of those stars is located right along a road. And then there's a field, you can see how it got light green right here. And then there's a field and houses all surrounding this wetland where frogs were found. And so we wanted to understand, how are these frogs surviving in this wetland? And how are things like walls, like buildings, houses, roads, streets, how are all of these things impacting frogs, and how are these frogs able to survive? So we can look at populations like this and try to understand what the frogs are doing that's allowing them to survive there. And if we can learn that, we can try to save other frogs, right? So that's a really cool example of what we can do to help is some research. And then there's a lot of other things that can be done too. So like I mentioned, amphibians such as this tiger salamander up here is found on the road. You can tell it's found on the white stripe or the paint on the road. And so what do you guys think is happening in this picture in the bottom left here? Does anybody have any ideas?
They're working on it.
Yeah, but how are they working on it? What are they doing?
They're digging. They're making, right?
Yeah, they're digging underneath the road, right? So what they did is they put a little tunnel under the road, and so then the frogs won't have to go on top of the road where it's dangerous, or the salamanders. They can go underneath and they can get through that tunnel so that they don't have to be worried about getting hit by a car, and they can travel safely and get from what looks like a wetland on one side, the side closer to us, right, where it's a little bit lower, and to that forest. So we talked about earlier, right, that a frog might have two different habitat types, wetland and forest. And so that culvert is what we call it, where that tunnel can help those amphibians safely get from one habitat to another. So it's a really cool way that some scientists and some researchers and planners have kind of worked together to help save some amphibians. And then you can do other things that is much more simple, such as hang a sign to make people aware of the fact that this is an area where amphibians are commonly crossing the road. So hopefully people will keep an eye out, they'll slow down. If a frog is crossing, maybe they'll wait a second and wait for it to hop so they don't have to hit it, and just make people more aware of these things. and prevent them from potentially hurting some amphibians that are just trying to get from one habitat type to another. And then you could do things like volunteer. So where I went to school in Maine, we have what's called a big night. And so oftentimes amphibians will move at the same time. So a lot of amphibians will be crossing the road at the same time. And one time that this happens is in the spring. So kind of like right now, things just started warming up not too long ago, right? And it was winter before that. So a lot of amphibians kind of hide and they hunker down for the winter when it's cold. And then as soon as it warms up, a lot of amphibians will move at the same time on the first rainy night to get to wetlands to breed. And so we call that our big night. And sometimes people will volunteer to go out and help amphibians cross the road and tell people to slow down, and especially if we know it's like a super busy area. And also where I went to school in Missouri, there's a road that's pretty well known for being called Snake Road, because the same thing happens. A lot of snakes will come out of these bluffs, these mountains, and try to cross a road to get to some wetlands at the same time. And they'll actually close the road down for a portion of the year to help protect all these animals. So there's lots that can be done. Research can be done. We can get creative and make things like these tunnels. We can provide awareness through things like this sign. And we can go out and help out and try to save these animals, which is really cool. And with that, that is all I had for you guys. So I will more than happy to take any questions you might have. Yeah, in the back.
Okay. How is a lizard different from a salamander?
Okay, that's a great question. So one of the big differences is that reptiles lay eggs that are more like hard-shelled eggs, and there will only be found one individual per egg. And eggs in reptiles, like a lizard, can also be laid on land because they are a bit more of a hard-shelled egg that can retain moisture, whereas salamander eggs are going to look more like that egg mass that I showed you in the water, that's more soft and jelly-like. And because it's soft and jelly-like, those eggs need to be found in the water. So one big difference I'll say in general is amphibians depend on water a bit more for laying eggs and for staying safe even when they're adults. They need to stay moist, whereas lizards don't need to. And then another big difference is salamanders have that soft, permeable skin, which means water and air can move through it, whereas lizards have scales. So things like snakes and lizards, they all have scales and they can tolerate slightly more dry conditions. So that's a really good question.
If the jelly around the tadpole, if oil came, what would happen to the jelly?
So he's asking if the tadpole when it's a tadpole or when it's still an egg?
It's an egg.
Okay, so while it's still an egg, if pollutants get into the egg, what could happen?
That's a good question. So we've also seen in things like fish, so oftentimes eggs are susceptible to pollutants. And by susceptible, I mean they can be impacted by pollutants. And so that can cause things like little tiny salamanders to get sick, and some of those deformities can even start happening at a really young age. So they could have things like there's gills. So little baby salamanders have gills. So those could possibly have some deformities or not function as well as they would if they were super healthy. And something else that we didn't even talk about that can also be a threat to amphibians is things like too much exposure to the sun can actually hurt them too, and that can cause some deformities. And so yeah, animals can get sick even through that egg, because that egg, that jelly, isn't a hard-shelled egg, so it's going to allow things to pass through it as well. So it's a good question.
All right, last question. happen. Jelly has to warm up. If it's before it's ready, before the egg is ready to hatch. What happens to the egg or what happens to the frog? But if the egg is disrupted, I guess, before it's ready to hatch.
So the biggest thing that's going to happen is kind of what I just mentioned is there may be some issues with growth or development within the egg. So like they may start to have problems with their gills even within the egg before the baby salamanders or tadpoles even come out. So you can see some cool pictures. I wish I included it of the little salamanders still within the eggs. So they start all the way from a tiny little embryo all the way until a salamander, until they're big enough to hatch out. So some of those developmental issues, so like we saw the frog with the 3 legs, right? Some of those things could start happening even as early as in the eggs. Sometimes what we'll see with tadpoles, so not salamander larvae, but the little baby frogs, the tadpoles, is they'll have kinks in their tails. They'll have kind of a crooked tail. So then they may not be able to swim because they use their tail fins to swim. So some of those things can start happening within the egg before it even hatches.
Okay, I think that's all of our questions, Mr. Tom.
Okay, it was so good to see you guys again today.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Take care. I hope we see you again